I devoted my entire life to one purpose, that my daughter could live the life I never had. What I didn't know was that one day, she would see me as her greatest enemy. My name is Helen Carter. I am 65 years old, and this is the truth of the life I gave away. I never planned to become the kind of woman who disappears behind responsibility. I had dreams once, quiet ones, practical ones, the kind you build slowly. A modest career, evenings that belonged to me, laughter that didn't feel borrowed. But the day my husband, George, died, my life narrowed to a single point. Survival. Not mine, hers. Samantha's. I learned early that grief in America doesn't pause the world. Bills still arrive. Work still expects you on Monday. The grocery store doesn't care that your heart has collapsed. So I swallowed my sorrow and did what women like me are taught to do. I kept going. I became the parent who never called in sick, the woman who worked late shifts and early mornings, the one who measured life in paychecks and school calendars. I told myself this was temporary, that once Samantha was grown I would return to myself. But years have a way of becoming decades when you're busy keeping someone else afloat. I missed things. Birthdays with friends. Trips I never took. Even small luxuries. New clothes, quiet weekends, rest. I told myself it didn't matter. Love, I believed, was proven through sacrifice. If I gave enough, surely my daughter would understand one day. Samantha was my entire universe. I watched her sleep as a child and promised myself she would never feel the instability I had known. I was careful. Proactive. Maybe too much. I set rules, checked homework, asked questions. I wanted her safe in a world that doesn't forgive mistakes easily, especially not for young women. But somewhere along the way my protection became her prison. I didn't notice it at first. Teenagers pull away, that's normal. Young adults test limits, that's expected. I told myself this distance was temporary. That once she saw how hard life really was, she would understand why I had been the way I was. Instead, she grew colder. Our conversations changed. Her voice hardened. The warmth between us thinned into something sharp and fragile. When she spoke to me, it was often with impatience, sometimes with contempt. She accused me of controlling her life, of never trusting her, of ruining her happiness. I listened. I absorbed it. I told myself this was part of loving someone, enduring the moments when love is not returned. Money became the language between us. Requests. Needs. Emergencies. I gave what I could even when it hurt. Even when I sensed that something wasn't right. I wanted peace more than I wanted to be right. And still she drifted further away. I remember the night I realized how invisible I had become. We were sitting at the same table eating dinner in silence. She was scrolling on her phone, barely looking up. I said her name twice before she acknowledged me. When she finally did, her eyes carried irritation, not affection. In that moment, I understood something that shook me deeply. I had given her everything and she resented me for it. That was the beginning of the truth I didn't want to face. I had built my entire identity around being a mother, believing love meant erasing myself. I didn't yet know how much that belief would cost me, or how brutally it would be tested. Because the life I gave away would soon demand a reckoning, and the choice my daughter was about to make would tear open every sacrifice I had ever buried. After George died, I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. In this country, grief is private and productivity is expected. There were forms to sign, insurance calls to return, a mortgage that didn't pause for mourning. The funeral passed in a blur of polite condolences and casseroles, and then the house went quiet in a way that felt permanent. Samantha was still a child, standing in the doorway of her bedroom with questions I couldn't answer. So I did what I had to do. I became everything. I became the income, the stability, the discipline, the comfort. I learned to speak to teachers and landlords with the same steady voice, even when my hands shook. I worked longer hours, sometimes 2 jobs back to back, because overtime meant groceries without worry and school supplies without shame. I learned how to stretch a paycheck, how to keep a car running past its prime, how to make a home feel safe even when I felt hollow. There were nights I sat in the car after work, just breathing, gathering myself before walking inside. Samantha needed a mother who was present, not broken. I didn't cry where she could hear me. I didn't let the world see the cracks. I told myself strength was silence and love was endurance. In America, people admire single mothers in theory. In practice, you're expected to manage quietly. There are no medals for exhaustion, no applause for choosing responsibility over collapse. You simply do it. You wake up, you show up, you keep going. I did all of it. Doctor appointments, parent-teacher conferences, packed lunches, late-night talks when Samantha was afraid of storms or tests or the dark. I learned to be firm and gentle at the same time, to say no without cruelty, to say yes without spoiling. I also learned what it meant to live without a safety net. There was no one to call when the washing machine broke or when the rent increased. No partner to share decisions with, no second opinion at the end of a long day. Every choice landed on me. Every mistake was mine alone. I carried that weight because there was no other option. As Samantha grew, I pushed her toward independence. I encouraged college plans, part-time work, responsibility. I wanted her to know how to stand on her own feet because I knew how unforgiving life could be. I didn't want her to rely on anyone the way I had once relied on George. I believed preparation was love. But preparation can look like pressure when you're young. I see that now. Back then, all I saw was time moving too fast in a world that wouldn't slow down. I thought if I stayed vigilant, if I stayed involved, I could protect her from the mistakes I had watched others make. I didn't understand that my vigilance might feel like surveillance. That my concern might feel like control. I loved her fiercely and imperfectly. I made choices out of fear as much as wisdom. And I kept telling myself that one day when she was older, she would see what I had done for her. She would understand why I had become so careful, so watchful, so involved. I didn't realize that while I was becoming everything, I was also becoming something she would one day push away. And I certainly didn't know that the man she would bring into her life would test every lesson I had learned about strength, sacrifice, and the cost of standing alone. I wish I could point to a single moment and say, this is when my daughter started hating me. But it didn't happen like that. It crept in quietly, disguised as independence. As opinions. As distance that felt normal until it didn't. Samantha changed the way she spoke to me before she changed the way she looked at me. Her answers became short, clipped, impatient. She stopped asking for advice and started announcing decisions. When I tried to offer guidance, she would sigh, roll her eyes, or tell me I didn't understand how things work anymore. I told myself this was just the generational gap people always talk about. Different times. Different rules. But the tension didn't stay small. She began accusing me of controlling her life. Of hovering. Of never trusting her. Every boundary I set, every question I asked, was twisted into proof that I didn't believe in her. If I asked where she was going, I was invading her privacy. If I worried about her finances, I was meddling. If I warned her about consequences, I was trying to ruin her happiness. I listened more than I spoke. I absorbed words that cut deeper than she knew. I told myself she was young, that anger often masks confusion. Still it hurt. I had built my life around caring for her, and now that care was being thrown back at me like an accusation. The hardest part was realizing she no longer saw my concern as love. To her it was a cage. We argued more often. Not loud, dramatic fights, but sharp exchanges that left silence hanging between us. She told me I didn't trust her judgment. I told her trust grows with responsibility. She said I never let her make her own mistakes. I said mistakes can follow you longer than you expect. We spoke the same language, but we weren't hearing each other at all. Money became a battleground. She asked for help more frequently, rent, expenses, temporary shortfalls. When I hesitated, she accused me of using money to control her. When I agreed, she accused me of reminding her too often. There was no winning. Everything I did was wrong simply because it came from me. What I didn't realize then was how deeply she resented the life I had shaped for her. She believed my sacrifices had come with invisible strings. That my expectations were debts she never agreed to pay. She wanted freedom without responsibility, independence without consequence. And I wanted her safe. The emotional distance between us widened until it felt physical. She stopped sharing details about her life. I learned things through fragments, through hints, through what she chose not to say. When I asked direct questions, she accused me of interrogating her. When I stayed quiet, she accused me of not caring. There was a moment, small, unremarkable on the surface, that changed how I saw everything. She looked at me during an argument, frustration sharp in her eyes, and said, "You've controlled my life for so long, you don't even know how miserable you've made me." I felt something break inside me then. Because in her mind, I wasn't a mother who had given everything. I was an obstacle. A problem. Someone standing between her and the life she believed she deserved. That was when I understood the truth I didn't want to face. My daughter wasn't just pulling away from me. She was preparing to choose someone else. I met Jason Reed on a quiet afternoon that felt ordinary at the time. Samantha brought him home without warning, her voice light and rehearsed as she said his name, as if introducing a solution rather than a person. He stood in my living room with an easy smile, confident posture, and the kind of charm that fills space quickly. He shook my hand firmly, looked me in the eye, and spoke as though he already knew me. On the surface, he was everything a mother is told to hope for: polite, articulate, attentive. But instinct doesn't speak in words. It settles in your chest. Jason talked easily about plans, about opportunities, about how ambitious people shouldn't stay small. He praised Samantha often, but always in a way that framed her potential as unfinished business, something he could help unlock. He asked questions about my work, my house, my schedule. Not intrusive, not obvious. Just curious enough to feel misplaced. I watched him carefully. The way he listened with half his attention. The way his eyes lingered on details that had nothing to do with connection and everything to do with comfort. He spoke about money casually, as if it were an inconvenience he expected to solve soon, preferably with someone else's help. When he laughed, it was loud and practiced. When he complimented me, it felt strategic. Samantha, meanwhile, was glowing. She leaned toward him, mirrored his words, defended him before I said a thing. It was clear she wanted my approval, but only on her terms. I recognized that look. The one that says, "Please don't ruin this for me." So I didn't. I told myself I could be wrong. That not every unease deserves a confrontation. That my fears might be shaped by years of protecting instead of trusting. I reminded myself that Samantha was grown. That this was her life to choose, not mine to manage. Still, the red flags kept appearing, subtle but consistent. Jason spoke often about needing support while he got on his feet. He mentioned past setbacks without ever taking responsibility for them. Every story had an obstacle, and every obstacle seemed to require patience from someone else. He talked about independence while quietly leaning on Samantha for stability. He framed his uncertainty as ambition and his lack of direction as transition. I noticed how quickly he grew comfortable. How naturally he settled into routines that weren't his. How he spoke about the future as if the present already owed him something. When Samantha laughed at his jokes, I saw pride in his eyes, not gratitude. One evening after he left, I tried to speak carefully. I told Samantha I liked his confidence, but that something felt rushed. I said love grows best when both people stand on their own feet. I chose my words gently, wrapping concern in calm. She didn't hear gentleness. She heard judgment. Her response was immediate and sharp. She accused me of assuming the worst, of projecting my fears onto her happiness. She said I had never trusted her choices and never would. She told me I was trying to control her life again, that I couldn't stand the idea of her choosing someone without my approval. I didn't argue. I listened. And I realized something important in that moment. Jason didn't need to convince her of anything. He was already convinced. He had stepped into a space where doubt lived, and he had filled it with reassurance that felt like freedom. But freedom built on borrowed strength is fragile. As Samantha defended him, I saw how tightly she had wrapped her identity around the idea of this relationship. Questioning him meant questioning her judgment, and she wasn't ready to do that. I understood then that my instinct, no matter how strong, would not be enough to stop what was coming. The warning was there. Unshakable. And I knew deep down that she was about to learn the difference between charm and character the hardest way possible. The morning of the wedding arrived heavier than I expected. The house was filled with motion. Phones buzzing, dresses hanging from door frames, voices moving in and out. But inside me, everything felt still. I stood at the kitchen window watching the sky, thinking how strange it was that a day meant to begin a life could feel so much like an ending. Samantha moved through the hours with determination, not joy. She was focused, controlled, almost rigid, as if doubt were something she had decided not to acknowledge. Jason arrived late, smiling easily, confident as always. He greeted everyone like a man stepping into something he already owned. I noticed how quickly he accepted attention, how naturally he took center space. No nerves. No humility. Just certainty. I told myself again that this was her choice. That my role was to support, not interfere. Still, the weight in my chest refused to lift. There was a moment just before the ceremony, when Samantha stood alone in the hallway adjusting her dress. The noise faded and instinct finally overpowered restraint. I asked her if we could talk. She hesitated, then nodded. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't plead. I told her exactly what I felt, that love should not feel rushed, that partnership should not require rescuing, that she deserved someone who stood beside her, not someone who leaned on her future. I told her my fear came from experience, not control. I reminded her that I would support her always, but I needed her to pause just for a moment and ask herself why everything felt so urgent. She stared at me as if I had betrayed her. Her response was sharp and final. She told me this was her life and that I had no right to interfere. She said I had controlled her long enough, questioned her long enough, and doubted her happiness long enough. She said I couldn't stand to see her choose someone who wasn't shaped by my expectations. And then she said something that cut deeper than anything else. If you really loved me, you would trust me. I felt my heart break quietly. I wanted to say so many things. That love isn't blind trust. That care asks questions. That instinct exists for a reason. But I saw it then. Her decision had already been made. Anything else I said would only push her further toward him. So I stepped back. The ceremony unfolded the way ceremonies do. Smiles. Music. Applause. From the outside it was perfect. Inside I felt like I was watching my daughter walk into a storm she believed was sunlight. Jason's vows were confident and polished, full of promises that sounded impressive but felt hollow. Samantha's voice trembled, not with nerves, but with the pressure of commitment she was forcing herself to believe in. When they were pronounced married, the room erupted in celebration. Everyone stood. Everyone cheered. I remained seated for a moment longer, steadying myself. I smiled when Samantha looked at me because that is what mothers do when they realize they are losing the ability to protect. That was the day I understood something painful and irreversible. You can warn someone with love. You can offer wisdom gently. But you cannot save someone who believes resistance is freedom. And as I watched my daughter walk away with the man my instincts had warned me about, I knew the hardest lesson of her life had just begun. The truth doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in through small compromises, quiet requests, and explanations that almost make sense. At first, Samantha sounded happy when she called. Busy. Settled. She talked about adjusting to married life, about shared routines and future plans. I listened carefully, searching her voice for cracks. I told myself I was imagining the strain. Then the requests began. They were framed as temporary. Jason was between opportunities. A delay in pay. An unexpected expense. Samantha spoke quickly as if rehearsed, assuring me it was nothing serious. She said they just needed a little help to get through a tight month. I asked questions, gentle ones, and she bristled. She said I was overthinking. She said marriage came with challenges I wouldn't understand. I understood more than she knew. Jason's presence grew heavier in our conversations, even when he wasn't on the line. Samantha began using his language, talking about investments, short-term setbacks, and support systems. When I hesitated, she reminded me of everything I had given her growing up, as if love were a ledger. I felt the shift then. The subtle move from partnership to pressure. I noticed how often Jason was mentioned alongside money. How rarely he was mentioned alongside effort. When I asked why he couldn't contribute more, Samantha defended him fiercely. He said he was trying. That he just needed time. That success doesn't happen overnight. I heard echoes of his voice in her words. Reassurances shaped to quiet doubt. And I realized he wasn't just asking her for money. He was teaching her how to ask me. The lies began small. Half-truths. Omitted details. She stopped telling me the full story, offering only what she thought I needed to hear to say yes. When I pressed, she grew defensive. When I stayed silent, she grew resentful. Our conversations became transactions stripped of warmth. I felt used and foolish, but mostly I felt afraid for her. There were signs she didn't recognize yet. Missed payments, postponed plans, promises that kept moving forward without ever arriving. Jason spoke confidently about the future while avoiding responsibility in the present. He talked about what they deserved, not what they had earned. And Samantha, exhausted and loyal, kept believing him. I tried again to express concern. I told her I was worried about the pattern I was seeing. She accused me of wanting her to fail, of hoping she would come crawling back. The distance between us widened into something fragile and sharp. I stopped calling as often. She stopped answering altogether. The night everything shifted, she called late. Her voice was tight, controlled. She said they needed help urgently. I asked what had happened. She hesitated, then offered a vague explanation that didn't add up. For the first time I said no. Not angrily. Not cruelly. Just firmly. The silence on the line was heavy. Then her tone changed. She told me I was abandoning her. That I had promised to support her. That I was choosing control over love. I listened until she finished, then repeated my answer. Oh. That was when I understood the truth marriage had exposed. Jason didn't just take money, he took certainty. He built his comfort on her fear of disappointing him, and he used my love as leverage. Samantha had mistaken devotion for duty and duty for love. And the lies that began as protection were now walls, separating her from me and from herself. That was the moment everything broke. Saying no did not feel powerful. It felt lonely. I had imagined that setting a boundary would bring relief, maybe even clarity. Instead it brought silence. The kind that presses against you at night and makes every memory louder. After that call, days passed without a word from Samantha. No messages. No explanations. Just absence. I told myself this was temporary, that emotions needed time to cool. But deep down I knew something fundamental had shifted. When she finally reached out again, it wasn't to talk. It was to accuse. She told me I had chosen money over my own child. That I had turned my back on her when she needed me most. She said I had proven everything she ever believed about me. That my love came with conditions, that my support was a tool for control. Her words were sharp, rehearsed, and devastating. I recognized Jason's influence in every sentence, but pointing that out would only harden her further. So I listened. I listened as she rewrote our history, turning years of sacrifice into manipulation. I listened as she dismissed my concerns as bitterness and my boundaries as cruelty. When I tried to explain that love doesn't mean unlimited access, she told me I didn't get to define love anymore. And then she said it, the sentence that closed the door completely. If you can't support us, then don't be part of my life. The line went dead. I sat there holding the phone, stunned by how final it felt. I wanted to call back. To explain again. To soften my words, to bend just enough to keep her close. But something inside me refused. Not anger. Not pride. Exhaustion. I had spent my life bending, absorbing, adjusting. This time I stayed still. The weeks that followed were some of the quietest of my life. I woke up to an empty house that no longer felt like a temporary phase. I moved through routines without purpose, cooking meals I didn't eat, setting places at the table out of habit. Friends asked about Samantha and I learned how to smile without answering. There is a particular loneliness that comes from being rejected by your own child. It carries a shame that is hard to explain. I questioned myself constantly. Had I waited too long to say no? Had I given too much before drawing the line? I replayed every moment, searching for the point where things might have turned out differently. But every path led back to the same truth. Continuing to say yes would have destroyed us both. Isolation has a way of clarifying things. Without the noise of crisis, I could see how deeply entangled Samantha had become in a life built on pressure and dependency. I understood then that rescuing her again would only delay the lesson she was already being forced to learn. Love, real love, sometimes requires allowing someone to feel the consequences of their choices. That realization did not bring comfort. It brought grief. I grieved the daughter I used to know, the closeness we once had, the future I thought we would share. I grieved the version of myself who believed sacrifice alone could protect someone from pain. And in that grief I accepted something I had been avoiding for years. I could not save her by destroying myself. The day I finally said no, I didn't gain strength. I lost everything that had defined me. And in that emptiness I stood alone, waiting, hoping, and fearing that this boundary might cost me my daughter forever. She came back on a gray afternoon, the kind where the sky feels low and unforgiving. There was no warning call this time. No message asking if it was okay. I heard the knock and knew before I opened the door that something had ended. Samantha stood there, thinner, older, and hollowed out in a way that had nothing to do with time. Her eyes avoided mine at first as if shame were a physical weight. She carried one small suitcase. Everything else had been left behind. When she finally looked up, her face crumpled, and the fight that had once lived in her shoulders was gone. We didn't speak right away. I stepped aside and she walked in. That was all the permission either of us needed. The story came in pieces. Quiet sentences. Long pauses. Jason had run out of explanations. The opportunities never materialized. The debts did. Promises turned into accusations and support turned into control. She spoke about nights spent calculating bills, about apologies that never changed anything, about realizing that love shouldn't feel like constant anxiety. When she mentioned the divorce, she said it flatly, as if emotion had been exhausted long before the paperwork was filed. I listened without interruption. This wasn't the moment for lessons. She didn't need confirmation that I had been right. She needed space to exist without being defended or judged. When she finished, she said the words I had imagined 1,000 times but never wanted to hear. "You warned me," she whispered. And I didn't listen. I felt relief and sorrow collide inside me. I wanted to pull her close and promise that everything would be fine. Instead, I chose honesty. I told her I was glad she was safe. I told her she could stay. I did not tell her that the past would disappear just because she had returned. The house adjusted to her presence slowly. She moved quietly, as if unsure of her place, as if afraid the walls might reject her the way the world had. At night, I heard her crying behind closed doors. I didn't rush in. Healing needs dignity as much as comfort. There were moments when anger flared, when I remembered how easily she had cut me out, how quickly she had believed I was the enemy. But anger softened into understanding. Pain had taught her what words never could. One evening, she sat across from me at the table and apologized. Not defensively, not emotionally, just honestly. She said she had confused independence with rejection and love with obligation. She said she finally understood what it meant to stand alone. I accepted her apology without ceremony. Forgiveness doesn't need an audience. She had come back broken but not empty. There was awareness in her eyes now and humility in her voice. She wasn't asking to be saved. She was asking to rebuild. And for the first time in a long while, I believed she might. Forgiveness came quietly without ceremony or conditions. It arrived the way truth often does, after exhaustion has stripped away denial. I forgave Samantha because holding on to anger would have turned me into someone I no longer recognized. But forgiveness did not mean forgetting, and it did not mean returning to the version of myself that erased boundaries in the name of love. I told her this one evening gently and clearly. I said she was welcome in my home, that I would support her healing, but I would not carry her life for her again. I would not fund her mistakes or shield her from responsibility. Love, I explained, does not require self-destruction. It requires honesty. She listened without interrupting. That alone told me how much she had changed. We rebuilt slowly, deliberately. She found work. She paid her share. She made decisions without asking for permission or money. When she struggled, she asked for guidance, not rescue. And when I spoke, she listened not as a rebellious daughter, but as an adult learning to trust wisdom earned through loss. There were still hard days. Trust doesn't return all at once. It grows in small acts, showing up on time, keeping promises, owning mistakes. I watched her do those things not perfectly but sincerely. And in those moments, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. I learned that motherhood does not end, but it must evolve. That love can be strong without being suffocating. That boundaries are not walls. They are bridges that keep relationships from collapsing under the weight of unspoken expectations. Samantha once asked me how I knew when to stop trying to save her. I told her the truth. I said I stopped when I realized saving her meant losing both of us. When love became fear. When sacrifice turned into control. That was not the legacy I wanted to leave her. Now when I look at my daughter, I see someone shaped by pain but not defined by it. He carries lessons that cannot be taught, only lived. And I carry a quieter strength, one built not on endurance alone but on discernment. I gave my life away once, believing that was love. I know better now. Love is not losing yourself so someone else can stand. Love is standing firmly and letting them learn how to stand beside you. And that is the kind of love I choose. Finally, and without apology. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to my channel so these voices don't fade in silence. And tell me in the comments, do you believe love should have boundaries, or should a parent sacrifice everything for their child? I read every comment.